There has been an aspect of Star Wars lore surrounding Dooku and Sidious that has always fascinated me, something that we've seen remarkably little of. Why didn't Darth Sidious train with Dooku? Well, we've looked into the lore extensively, and perhaps maybe he did, but not in the ways that most think. Let's analyze everything we learned. Sidious has had multiple apprentices throughout his tenure as the Dark Lord. The second most successful of them was Darth Tyrannus, or better known as Count Dooku. His path to the dark side is legendary due to how dissimilar it is from many other stories of fallen Jedi. Dooku's reasoning for becoming a Sith hadn't been an emotionally charged decision, but rather was one made of logic and rationale. But part of his journey into the Order of the Dark Lords was of course his training, once he swore Sidious as his true master. Interestingly, Palpatine is unlike many other lords of the past, as even though he's eager to take on new apprentices, we rarely actually see him teach them hands-on in any way, unless it's Lord Vader, and even then, the lessons are rare. Unlike Darth Plagueis, who was prone to long lectures about dark side theory, Palpatine taught almost exclusively through experiences. But we don't really hear or see tales of Dooku's training, or his deeper relationship with his master Sidious. We don't really hear or see tales of any of Dooku's adventures. So why is this? Why did Sidious see it fit to teach Tyrannus' Sith Academia as an afterthought? Well, let's open a holocron and dive into the minds of two of our favorite characters in all of the lore. It should be noted that we aren't saying Dooku was not trained at all. We are told through the Legends novel Labyrinth of Evil that Tyrannus actually trained for upwards of 10 years in secret on Coruscant. There was a very shady part of the world's surface which was known as the Works District. No one really lived over there, and the Jedi activity was practically non-existent. There was nothing but droids, construction projects, and mob activity in this part of town. It was here where we have the high-rising rotunda building that Dooku spent his formative Sith years training, under Darth Sidious. This being the same building where Dooku meets with Sidious after the Battle of Geonosis, and the same building where he murdered Jedi Master Yaddle. Due to the specifications of his private shuttle, Dooku was able to slip right into the atmosphere unnoticed and learn the Sith way right under the noses of the Jedi. In the book, it says that Dooku spent his years learning the dark arts, perfecting his craft, and as Dooku guessed, Yoda would have called it, mastering evil. But this Sith training was very much unlike the type of curriculum we saw Sidious undergo when he trained with Plagueis, or really, how any other Sith has been trained at all. Dooku's training was extremely unique. Count Dooku was a man who didn't have to be coaxed to the dark side. Unlike Vader and Maul, Sidious did not thrust the dark side upon them. Dooku and his musings believed to join the dark side was to obey the will of the Force. His mindset was like a dark, twisted version of Qui-Gon Jinn's, where to maintain balance would mean to listen to the shifting waves of the Force and embrace the rising tide of darkness. This is what Dooku says. The problem was partially somatic, in that the Jedi Order had seen to it that the dark side of the Force had become equated with evil. But was shade more evil than stark sunlight? Recognizing that the dark side was an ascendant, the Jedi, in service to the Force, should have known enough to embrace it, to ally themselves with it. After all, it was all a matter of balance, and if the preservation of balance required the dark side to be on top, then so be it. Ever since he was a child, Dooku had a fascination with the dark side, and in both canon and legends, he snuck into the forbidden section of the Jedi archives to admire a Sith holocron, one specifically. In some of the later years of his youth, he would even learn from it a little. In canon, it was even revealed that Dooku had an innate ability to conjure force lightning, which was what he did to save himself and his young sister from a gang of pirates that had tried to kidnap them. But while this ability was frightening and even scared a young Dooku, it seems that it didn't eschew it altogether. In secret, Dooku practiced Force lightning, familiarizing himself with the ability that the Jedi would have condemned. And at one point, this practice came in handy when he saved Qui-Gon from an assassin. But in that moment, Dooku took it too far and nearly tortured the assassin to death until Qui-Gon begged for his life. Dooku was a man who believed in practicality. His turn towards the dark side was largely for political reasoning, but there was a part of him that was frustrated and disillusioned with the Jedi for not doing the right thing at the time that it needed to be done, or for not exploring parts of the Force that could help them change the galaxy for the better. By the time Dooku became the apprentice of Sidious, Palpatine himself didn't need to do any of the heavy lifting in Dooku's case. Dooku had already learned to hate the Jedi. All that work was done. To perfectly describe this and what Dooku's training was like, the book Labyrinth of Evil says this. With Dooku, Sidious hadn't had to waste precious hours on lightsaber technique, nor on ridding Dooku of ill habits, habits born of a lifetime spent in the Jedi Temple, for Dooku had long before rid himself of those. Instead, Sidious had focused on giving Dooku what had amounted to a crash course in tapping into the power of the dark side, a mere taste of which had been intoxicating to him, enough to convince Dooku that no course was left open to him but to abandon the Order. More than his entire life had been preparation for his apprenticeship under Darth Sidious, that at long last he had found a true mentor. The Sith saw no need to take on only young disciples, though they often did. Sometimes the training went smoother with disciples who had lived long enough to grow disillusioned, or angry, or vengeful. The point that this makes is that Dooku was halfway there before he ever pledged himself as a Sith. He just needed to be shown the specifics of the dark side. In this case, their study would have been much more academic, and not an emotional journey like Vader or Maul. Tyrannus was a go-getter, a pursuer of knowledge personally, which meant that Sidious's teachings were a lot more hands-off than other Sith Lords. But as a result of this, we notice that their relationship is different than Sidious had with Maul or Vader. This is to say, Sidious and Dooku were not very close at all. They didn't have that teacher-student bond, and their interactions were always extremely formal. The nature of their relationship was more like two like-minded men pursuing the same goal, but always keeping an eye on the other. Since they were both much older, with Dooku actually being Palpatine's superior in age, there was a lot of mistrust between them naturally. What's interesting is seeing how Dooku's perspective on the Force and the Sith changes as the Clone Wars rage on. At first, Dooku's mindset was about balance in the Force, and how choosing the dark side had been a practical decision rather than an emotional one. In fact, he had even compared Sidious and Yoda to be quite similar, saying this about them in the book. More than once it had occurred to Dooku that Sidious and Yoda had certain qualities in common, principally that neither was either what they entirely appeared to be. That is, made frail by age, or by the intensity required to master the Sith or the Jedi arts. But as the Clone Wars became longer and more violent, Dooku slipped deeper and deeper into his persona of Tyrannus, and soon he became obsessed with Sith lore and knowledge. He wasted no time in training a host of personal dark acolytes to do his bidding, charging some with concerns on the war effort, or tasking others with the retrieval of Sith artifacts. At this point, he didn't need Palpatine because he was doing his own research. He looked into the histories and located such superweapons like the Dark Reaper, a weapon which could tear the life from an entire army. The weapon had even been used once by Exar Kun, but had been lost to history. Luckily for the Jedi, Dooku would never find the entire weapon, and would be stopped by none other than Anakin Skywalker. But in his research, his prized collectibles were Sith holocrons, just like Sidious. In fact, Dooku would actually go back to the Jedi Temple for one specific holocron in the library, one that fascinated him in his youth. Dooku broke back into the archives via a complicated plot involving new lightsaber-resistant droid prototypes in order to distract the Jedi while he delved deeper into the heart of their temple. Along this way, he used Quinlan Vos to find the holocron of Darth Endedu, the same one used by Darth Bane to discover the secret to immortality. Within that holocron was an ancient red lightsaber crystal which Dooku would actually gift to Quinlan. And finally, he had one other Sith holocron that we don't know much about, other than he gifted it to the leader of the Gen Sarai Order, which was a Force-based cult who believed themselves to be neutral in the Force, but were actually practicing the dark side unknowingly. Perhaps that gift was to bring them deeper into the darkness, so that Dooku could use them. In fact, we're sure that's why he gave them the Sith holocron. By the time Dooku had reached the final year of the Clone Wars though, he was a completely different man. He was vile, cruel, taking pleasure in the torture of others, the fall of the Jedi to the dark side, and even started slaying Jedi by his own hand, something he had vowed against in the very beginning of the war. In this way, Dooku is extremely different from Anakin or Maul. He had successfully killed his former self completely. He gave in fully to the Sith doctrine, unlike Vader, who could never let go of the part of him that was Anakin. Maul, of course, though, was born into darkness. It is all he knew. He did not choose it on his own, but Dooku did. Dooku required very little to no push from Darth Sidious. We've spoken before about how Dooku had mercy on Obi-Wan in their final duel, because essentially he saw Obi-Wan as his grandson. But interestingly, that heartfelt sentiment did not extend as a loving one, but one of possession. Tyrannus loathed Anakin and desperately wanted Kenobi to be a part of the Sith. He felt like Obi-Wan alive because he wanted to salvage the chance that he could become a Sith apprentice one day. Dooku believed that when the Empire rose, he would destroy and reform the Jedi Order into a Sith army for the Emperor. But it's likely that Dooku was planning on overthrowing Palpatine at some point and forcibly taking Obi-Wan as his apprentice. This twisted mindset proves that he was truly lost and would never return. Jedi Dooku is dead, and redemption was impossible. But Sidious was always ahead. This meant Dooku suffered from his ambitions. The Count was far too trusting of his master, far too trusting of his plans, and that he would see it through. In reality, the plan was very different than what the two Sith had discussed. Palpatine was either negligent of Dooku's potential or afraid of it. He only ever saw Dooku as a threat and a tool to be cast aside at a moment's notice. From the moment of Dooku's death, Sidious would never refer to him as anything more than a piece in a game that must be sacrificed, or a ballistic missile to be pointed in one direction and then thrown away. It was because of this sentiment that we never saw a reason to make Dooku's training anything special. There was no need for a significant investment in time or effort. Not only was Dooku basically training himself, but Sidious also knew that he was by no means an end, a stepping stone to the real prize, Anakin Skywalker. But anyway, my friends, this was why Dooku didn't really train with Darth Sidious. And what are your thoughts on the very little information we have about the formative years of Dooku's Sith training? Had you hoped to see more insight as to what happened immediately following his turn to the dark side? We were very excited once we found these passages in Labyrinth of Evil, as we've been looking at Dooku and Sidious's relationship for years now, as they're two of our favorite characters, and we'll never miss an opportunity to talk about Sidious. But for both of these men, they were incredibly complex, and nothing about them is what meets the eye, including their relationship with one another. In a lot of ways, Dooku and Sidious are extremely similar to one another. But anyway, friends, thank you so much for watching, may the Force be with you, and have a phenomenal day.